right, welcome to Literary Deep Dives and Discussions. So, for 2026, we're going to start diving into other series. Yes, I'll still be doing podcasts about the Unseen Operative series, especially as we go into book 2. But we're also going to take a little step back and do some deep dives into some classical literature, some modern literature, just wherever we feel needs a deep discussion. And so, Zach has picked for us Mere Christianity to kickstart the year. And he is actually going to lead this discussion, so it should be a lot of fun. We'll be covering, the foreword and chapter 1 in this episode, and just do consecutive chapters, like either chapter 2 or chapter 2 and 3 for the following episodes.
Yeah, so the first thing that stood out to me when going through the preface, and I'll kind of read part of this paragraph to kind of give an idea as to what the discussion is about. So, the word gentleman originally meant something recognizable, one who had a coat of arms and of some landed property. When you called someone a gentleman, you were not just paying him a compliment, but merely stating a fact. If you said he was not a gentleman, you were not insulting him, but giving him information. There was no contradiction in saying that John was a liar and a gentleman, any more than there is now in saying that James is a fool and an M.A. But then there came people who said so rightly, charitably, spiritually, sensitively, so anything but useful. Ah, but surely the important thing about a gentleman is not the coat of arms and the land, but the behavior. Surely he is the true gentleman who behaves as a gentleman should. And so one of the things that he goes into, let's see here, I'm just going to skip down a little bit. It says, to call a man a gentleman is this new refined sense becomes in fact not a way of giving information about him, but a way of praising him. To deny that he is a gentleman becomes simply a way of insulting him. And so the word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise. It no longer tells you facts about the subject. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude in that subject. So that's the biggest thing that stood out to me, was that the gentleman, the word has lost all meaning. And so I guess I mostly wanted to start off this discussion talking about what other words because I feel like there's more than a dozen, maybe even close to 1,000 words that we all use in the modern English language that have lost all meaning. We've either completely changed their meaning or given them double or triple meaning based upon context, which does not make sense logically.
Yeah, it's so just a little bit of context of where this comes from in Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis is effectively describing how the term Christian no longer means what it used to. Christian, by its pure definition, is literally just one who follows Christ. That is it. And yet we as a population have decided that there's such thing as calling instead of calling a Christian a good Christian or a bad Christian, calling somebody a Christian automatically means they have to be good. And so the problem is by merging definitions, is it adjectives? Merging the descriptor with the actual definition, therefore ruins the proper use of the word. So instead of, what he's saying with a gentleman is the literal definition of a gentleman used to be that it was somebody who bore a coat of arms. Anybody could be a gentleman. You could be a bad gentleman, you could be a good gentleman. But because of blending those things now, a gentleman only means somebody of refined taste. And yeah, you're right. Like, we do that with so many words. I jotted down a couple, but the first one that comes to my mind is a saint. There's a famous saying by Mandela, that I'm not a saint unless a saint is a sinner who keeps trying, something like that. Sure. I know I butchered that right now. My head is not working, but yeah, whenever we call somebody a saint or a sinner, we immediately just ascribe good and bad to it. Sinner equals bad, saint equals good. Mm-hmm. And that's not true. You could be a good sinner, as in we all sin. We all fall short of the glory of God. That is basic Christianity. But you're a good sinner if you're constantly repenting and trying to improve. Therefore, a good sinner is the same as being a saint in the way that we call saints good or esteem them as good. But at the same time, a saint, it has a very different definition depending on which religious context that you're in. But overall, as a general theme, when we think of the word saint, we mean you're somebody who's very, very good. And that is not the literal definition of the word saint. So there's those ones in the religious context. Some other ones that I always jump on in my podcast, though, is like hard. Hard equals bad in our minds. And so the value of the word hard no longer exists properly. Yeah. Hard is a descriptor of difficulty, and difficulty doesn't mean something is good or bad, and yet we're like, oh, if it's hard, it's bad. I don't want to do it. If it's easy, it's good. I want to do it. I want the easy way. I want none of that difficulty. And essentially when we're saying that, we're saying that I don't want the growth that comes with it, because hard doesn't equal bad. Hard is just, difficult can be good if you make it good. It can be bad if you make it bad. It's just that it's lost its meaning with that blend.
Yeah, and one of the things that I took away from this too is like when you come to the realization. I mean, I've even noticed it when I try to talk. The meaning of the word like, and how often we unintentionally put it in our vocabulary. It's such a filler word. Same with swear words or different descriptors that really don't, I guess words that aren't meant to be descriptors that have changed into that. It's so, there are so many words that are emotionally charged now, such as you spoke about in the book, instead of having a factual sense of each meaning. So for example, saying something is cool, saying something is dank, those aren't necessarily words that are as popular, but they've been reapplied in ways that really don't make sense if you know the true meaning of the word. Something that is dank is like dark and drip and dreary, and it's kind of more or less used to describe like a wet basement rather than cool or awesome, or I guess or there's so many ways that people have reinterpreted or re-put together. Sick, people say sick,
yeah,
and
like that's so sick.
It's supposed to be cool, or even that, and cool itself is cold, or it's temperature. It's not necessarily what it's supposed to mean. And so there's so many words that have been lost in the English language because we've replaced them with words that have double, triple meaning, and it's I think that's one of the reasons why we've lost our sense of articulation. We don't properly speak in very many ways. We're quite confusing to most individuals who learn English in a proper way, and then they come to America.
Yeah.
And but the bigger issue from all of that, setting aside the fact that it's really confusing for people to properly articulate what they're actually trying to say, not only from generation to generation. I remember my grandma, before she passed, on my dad's side, there were several things that I had said that were teenage slang, and she often had to ask clarification from my dad. What does he mean by that? And that's pretty sad if you think about it. Having a proper conversation with someone 1 to 2 generations older than you, like, that's really important. There's a lot of information, a lot of experiences, a lot of stories that need to be passed on for our benefit, for our learning. And when you don't pass that on anymore, and it seems like almost every generation now, ever since the creation of the internet, it's gotten to the point where every generation in between has so many nuances and new words. I mean, there's this like Gen Z slang. I've heard some of it, and it's beyond nonsense. And I think that it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, I agree completely. See, for a general listener, this might not seem like a big deal. For a lot of authors, it doesn't seem like a big deal. They're like, people will understand what we're saying based off of context. That's super cute. But most people don't actually gather things off of context. Everybody's context comes from their basic upbringing, understanding of things, and it is always different. So essentially what's happening is we are corrupting our own language. I don't know if you've ever heard what actual English, like good, solid, proper, old English sounds like, but it's nothing like how we speak English. And it's very difficult to understand. Where we run into problems with this is historically speaking. There are so many issues right now with, what historically happened back then in this event and that event. And it is difficult enough to try to translate old lost languages. It's even more difficult to have to go back through all these different generational slangs to try to translate from there as well. So where it becomes a problem is 50, 60, 70 years from now, it might not seem like a big deal. 200, 300, 400, 1,000 years from now, it is a huge deal because our basic histories will be very, very difficult for them to understand. And so historical facts become skewed, they become misrepresented. And suddenly there's this constant turmoil of, well, our history books have lied because somebody just retranslated it more properly and it actually says this now. And there's all these arguments that occur. We as a human population, through the lack of proper articulation, proper definition, proper standards on language, are basically ruining ourselves to constant confusion and derision. And I mean, I have lived in a culture, the Filipino language is very abstract. They are very simple. They don't have a whole ton of words. And you do have to seriously listen to context to figure out anything that they're talking about. It takes a very, very long time to have a proper conversation in a language like that. It's rather exhausting. Like a language that would take us about 25 minutes in basic English, articulate English, took us about 2 hours in the Philippines. Granted, I was learning the language, but even so, just to get to the point, the words were very long, the linkers were very long, the context was very long-winded, and it's because I have to put my 25 cents in about how stupid language has become, and not just in our generation. The slang of most generations, corrupting the proper definitions of words is, I'm not quite sure there's a proper way to articulate it other than it is pure stupidity. I remember when I was in college, and I was a health science major in my first degree, learning all the proper anatomy parts and whatnot, and there was a lot of teenagers that would go around and they'd be spouting out certain body parts as slang. And I'm just, you kind of sit back like that as an educated person, you say, wow, that's pretty much like going around saying my thumb. This is a cuss word now, my thumb. And like, how stupid does that sound? It's childish, it's immature, it makes no sense. And so then when you go to give a proper lecture on these words, you have a bunch of teenagers laughing instead of actually growing in knowledge and intellect. And so our language, it becomes not only corrupted, but it loses the beauty and profound truth that is therein. Because it's not just slang that does that. It's everyday interactions with others, everyday talking, and it translates to literature because this is what authors are writing now.
Well, another thing too is if we're struggling to understand historical context as well as historical documents that were written like 100 years ago, no wonder there's so many debates about whether or not the true meaning of like the first 10 amendments that were constantly debated on what it actually means for the right to bear arms and other things like that. There's so much context, and as well as the written language of it, that people are reinterpreting what that means or what it should mean today. And it is pretty scary to see that some of the things that should stay the same are constantly being demanded for change because of the context being basically lost, because language is being changed and altered in such a, I don't know, I think it's quite terrifying how some language is just losing all meaning. And also just, I can't imagine trying to teach kids in today's generation. Like I can't imagine the upcoming generation of kids trying to teach them proper English, but you only go so basic. Yeah, that's part of the problem is our English literature I mean, even for me, I felt like they didn't really teach me English literature. They pretty much only taught me how to write essays. And the grading was very, very minimal. Like I think most of the time, what they were looking for is the amount of words and not too much of a repeat. And that's almost just the basic idea of what an essay is, rather than it almost feels like a lot of what I was taught in school was concept only or concept first. And if you understood concept, then the actual meat of what is supposed to be formed through those concepts is lost, because that's not, for one, they figured that every kid's going to go to college and learn it there anyway, which is another problem. And two, in addition to that, there's so much repeat of the same stuff that you're not really building. I feel like when you actually get into high school, that's when you should really start building upon the principles. And at least here in America, we're not building, we're just reiterating in a slightly higher level. Is honestly, I don't know, there's just not that much love for the important part.
Yeah, actually, that word alone, important. Words used to be powerful. They can be powerful still, but they're losing their power because they're losing their significance in the incorrect ways that we are now using them. And, the English language as well, literature in general, I have such a problem with. I pick up an indie author book. Sometimes a traditional published, but usually it's an indie author book, and there is no proper quotations, there's no proper grammar, the order of it is just completely wonky. You would think that they hadn't even learned how to write an essay, because they don't know how to properly format a book. And it's just cringy. Like, I don't know about any viewers out there, but when I open up Mere Christianity, when I open up this book, the way that it is written with proper paragraph separation, proper topic separation, organized order, all of that, it's beautiful. It is exciting. And it is just crushing to pick up some random book that somebody just was so excited to publish because, this is an exciting story for them. But they didn't love enough to make it a well-written book. Like, I cringe at that. There's a reason that we have proper, English writing skills. Like, you ought to learn those things, but they don't even teach that anymore. Like,
sure,
they don't teach that in English. I was talking to a fellow indie author, and she said, I never learned, like, where you were supposed to start the next person speaking in a book. Shocked. I'm like, I swear I learned that in 3rd grade. How do you not know that? Because if you read a book, a properly, traditionally published book that has been edited and formatted properly, it has that. And yet they don't get it. So there's that. But it also, words in general used to have power. When people used to speak the name of Christ specifically, it had power. When people used to curse, it was used very rarely. It had significant power. Nowadays, it's so casual that people dropping the F-bomb every other word, like, it has no power. All you sound like is a whining toddler, or just somebody who is sex obsessed. It's nonsense. What I love about what C.S. Lewis is pointing out here is that words ought to be used carefully so that they have their proper power. Sure. Instead of giving disproportionate power to words by assigning whether they are good or bad, like, instead of aggrandizing saints and lowering sinners, having that proper term, so then we can use the words, whether they are good or bad, to really give in the context, to give it the proper power, instead of, the craziness and making people feel bad or making people feel like they're God.
Sure.
That would bring back a proper order to how we speak with one another, how we kindle faith versus crushing faith, because so many individuals feel that they cannot live up to this impossible standard of a saint because they're a sinner, when in reality saints and sinners are on the same level in definition. It is just a different side of things, and we get to determine whether we are good or bad at those things. We shouldn't be putting so much power into labels that don't matter. That doesn't just go for religious things, it goes for when we call people fat or skinny. In the Philippines, fat or skinny, that is the only descriptors there are for your size. You're either fat or skinny. There's no in between. And being an American going into that cultural context, because of the power that is put on the word fat being derogatory here and skinny being good, I struggled with that massively. So massively. But in reality, it's like being fat or skinny isn't good or bad. It's just who you are. Yeah. You can be unhealthily fat. You can also have healthy fat in a nutritional context. So
same with skinny. You could be unhealthily skinny.
You could be unhealthy. I was unhealthily skinny once. So.
And you can be healthily skinny. And and that's exactly what he's trying to preface throughout this entire book, is that when he uses the terms that he's using and when he's describing the things that he's using, such as in chapter 1, human nature,
yes,
and that being much different than what people normally think or describe, that's really powerful, because when you think about it, the way he explains it just makes more sense than if we tried to take what we know as our own basic definitions. If anything, I would say this book is much more important now than it even was when it first came out, which already he talks about how distraught he is with the amount of slang and the amount of misappropriation of words, meanings, and actions. And so it's one of those things where it doesn't take very much to think about to realize like how much change has happened, especially since then. And in addition to that, you can easily think for probably a little too long how many words, how many definitions, and how emotionally charged and invested we are in what people are saying, rather than the truth of what they are trying to say. And too many people are, even sometimes between us, we misinterpret what we're saying, but that's just because we're misinterpreting definitions of words that only carry one definition, and yet we've found new ways to describe them, which makes no sense when you look through Webster's dictionary what's that supposed to mean. And therefore we're just either offending each other or putting each other up on pedestals in ways that don't make any sense.
Exactly.
Whoa.
Yeah, dictionaries as well used to be a solid place to find word definitions, and you can still find the proper definition first, but I highly dislike how, because of the modern vernacular, they are now adding the modern definition underneath the proper definition so that you know the slang context, and that just really, it ought not to be a thing. A lot of distresses, as you're describing, would not exist if we would properly articulate and properly use words as they ought to be used. They would have power again, and they would have meaning again, and there's a lot less of a chance of misunderstanding if we can properly articulate.
I also think it's important for, the same way with, creating new definitions for basic descriptors. That's so... It just creates a lot of problems when we call ourselves fat, skinny, all these different labels, whether we're good or bad. And, that all comes down to not only our own self-judgment, but we're allowing judgment from others to create a stronghold on us. We no longer have power over our own lives when we start to reinvent what it means to be fat, what it means to be skinny, because in reality that there are just so many nuances to to everything. There's so many different ways that we can be a certain thing without it being good or bad. There's certain attributes that we attribute ourselves in ways that are really just not beneficial. We're no longer benefiting from understanding ourselves. We're now criticizing or putting ourselves on pedestals in ways that are very detrimental to not only our own mental health, because if you positive your way up to the heavens, then you're just going to be narcissistic and or unrealistically unsatisfied with how actually not happy you are versus how happy you think you should be because everything's perfect versus everything's the worst thing it could possibly be, rather than having a realistic expectation of the good and the bad, because both are necessary for a healthy mental life as well as being able to build relations with other individuals.
Yeah, there's this extremist nature of thinking nowadays that things are either or. You're either good or bad. You're either great or not. You're either successful or you're not. In reality, both and is the narrative that we should always be using.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can be a very kind person and I can be a complete brat. Those are two sides of me. They both exist. And by trying to say that I'm only one or the other, I put myself at this constant incongruency, or I'm constantly deriding on myself, because how can I be good and bad at the same time? It makes no sense, because our culture is either or extremity.
Yeah.
And a lot of mental issues, a lot of emotional struggles would severely be diminished, and often are. I mean, I once got this from a therapist as well, is you have to get rid of that either or thinking and accept both parts of you, that you are doing very, very well in these aspects of your life while you're also struggling with others.
Yeah.
That you are indeed a very kind and caring person, but you're also kind of selfish. It's and.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it tries to take the complexity out of speech and language and puts it in such basic terms. But when you do that, you no longer have the power, the ability to. I mean, that's the thing, is it's you're no longer empowering yourself. You're no longer empowering others. You're either putting them down or lifting them up in a very unfair manner.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that stood out to me, like, the most about it, is until you realize that what we're actually saying when we say someone is a gentleman versus what we think a gentleman ought to be, then you've really changed a whole lot. Not just in a very basic sense, but you're simultaneously alienating those who have achieved a status and then putting a status on someone who doesn't deserve it.
Yeah.
And so it's that double-edged sword of language in general.
We all need structure, and that's something that, as an independent thinking country, an individualistic country, we don't like to admit, is structure is necessary. It's a religious argument constantly that, commandments are always restricting. That's the same thing that criminals say against law. It's restricting. But in reality, these things are structure that keeps us safe. Definitions, proper use of words, they are a structure that keeps us safe. And a basic way to kind of really understand this is letters, words, and sentences. If you have a letter, but you don't have a proper, order of how it's supposed to form a word, you will never be able to form that word. You will never be able to speak. And sure, I might want the freedom to use that letter however the heck I want, but without the rules, it has no meaning, it has no power. And when you can't even give a simple word, it's terrifying. When I was first in the Philippines and I didn't know a lick of the language because I had been learning Tagalog and they were speaking Ilocano, that was the most terrifying experience of my life. I could not say a word. I mean, I could speak English, but nobody understood me. I didn't understand anybody. And there is no worse feeling than being that helpless and isolated and alone. Mm-hmm. So there are powers. There is power in structure. We need it. We absolutely need it. And by trying to diminish it and destroy it, we're destroying ourselves.
Yeah, so I think this is probably a good little paragraph to continue on to the second point, because without the first point, the second point basically means nothing and just turns into a giant argument. But here in page 4 on the
law or rule about right and wrong.
Yeah.
The law of nature.
Yeah, he talks about the law of nature. Sorry, I was trying to think of chapter 1. Chapter 1, page 4. And now this law or rule about right and wrong used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays we talk of the laws of nature in air quotes. We usually mean things like gravitation or heredity or the laws of chemistry. But when the older thinkers called the law of right and wrong the law of nature, they really meant the law of human nature, the idea that just as all bodies are governed by the law of gravitation, organisms by biological laws, so are the creatures called man also had his law, with his great difference that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but the man could choose whether to obey the law of human nature or to disobey it. So he does go into a bit more into depth, but that's what really got me thinking a lot, is that there are certain things that regardless of what we do, we have to and we're forced to obey. That's the interesting thing about if you change the meaning of language itself, you are now changing the way that people perceive their conversation. And that changes the way that people behave and interact with each other in general. Now, one of the things that it talks about is fairness, right? Everybody prescribes an idea that things need to be fair, regardless of what happens. And it's funny because even the most vile of people, of individuals, require some amount of trust and require some amount of fairness, because if they feel because they can and will feel wronged, even if they themselves do a lot of wrong. And that's kind of the basis of understanding what he's talking about in the law of nature, is that irregardless of the goodness of an individual or the badness of the individual, everybody understands on a very fundamental level, even in ways that we don't recognize until you really start to think about human behavior and psychology, is that individuals have a set of, in the back of their mind, idea of what things are supposed to be like. And everybody has a sense of fairness and justice, and that is what brings us all to a point or a state where it's never truly pandemonium.
Yeah, I love these 3 pages so much. He articulates it so beautifully. The law of nature is essentially a law of decent human behavior. We all have it. And he points out that people will argue that there are quite different moralities, that this doesn't apply across the board. And he says this is not true. There have been differences between moralities, but there's never been anything that amounts to a total difference. He says if you look at the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, Romans, you'll often more likely be struck by how similar they are than different. And he needs only ask the reader to think what a total different morality would actually mean. You might as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5, where men have differed as regards to how people ought to be unselfish, whether it was by you or your own family or your fellow countrymen or whatnot, but you've always agreed on one thing, that you should not put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether they should have 1 wife or 4, but they've always agreed that you must not simply have any woman that you like. There's a basic moral principle, and I observe this all the time today, like on Instagram and whatnot. So many people are like, I can go around party and have sex with whoever, but heaven forbid you cheat on me. See, there's a double standard happening there, because inherently we all have a principle of morality within us, whether we were raised religiously or not. There is a right and wrong, and we know it. Even criminals know it. Just kind of like the point you were making that he makes is, sure, you might say, there's no right and wrong, but the moment that something swings against you, something's wrong, and you will have a problem with it. So it is an inherent human principle, and that's the first point he makes. And then the second point he makes is that none of us properly live within it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess a good way to put, condense that into a couple of short sentences is that the general idea is that we all have a sense of nature within us, that nature is inherently selfish, and in addition to that, we don't always follow it. We are inconsistent with our own nature. And that's why it can be quite confusing or easy to say that things aren't exactly one way. But the truth of the matter is that we, first and foremost, are selfish creatures, and we think about ourselves, and that's where fairness comes in. We think of our own fairness for ourselves. That's first and foremost. And then we break from that on a regularly consistent basis, pretty much just based upon how we're raised and the different, I guess, social acceptances of certain things. But at the end of the day, we all crave fairness for ourselves. And that's where we get so much similarity, is when we focus on fairness for ourselves, but we turn outward, we realize that we want to reciprocate that fairness. And that's where the general ideas or premises of, I guess, Christian principles kind of.
Yeah, it's quite a balance of, what's right or wrong, because we always look at, the modern saying is it has to be taken by each specific situation, each specific circumstance. That's how we want judgment to be, because we think, it's not fair to break the law. Nobody should break the law, except if it keeps an entire family together within this country. That is a political argument. It's the first one that came to my head. But sure. On the other hand, another one is this college problem that's constantly brought up is if a man, his wife is dying from cancer and this facility has the medication and he cannot afford it and she's about to die, is it right for him to go steal it so that she can live? And some will argue, well, yes, it's okay to break the law because he is trying to save her life. When it's life or death, the laws of morality, they go out the door. And others will argue, no, those laws don't go out the door. Just because it's your wife doesn't make it fair for you to have it versus all the other people in that hospital dying, maybe in debt as well, because and they need it too, Mm-hmm. So there is that. We know there's right or wrong, but because of our human selfishness, the nature that competes against it, we want it to change for us. And essentially what C.S. Lewis is kind of demonstrating to me in this is the reality that the principle of inclusivity as we modernly want it is crap. It cannot exist. It literally does not stand within itself. It defeats itself just like so many social movements do. And the reason is because if we were to accept and embrace everybody as they are, this country would be destroyed. You cannot take a Satanist and put them in a Christian denomination and they're going to get along. They will argue. They will never get along. Inclusivity cannot exist so much as we have a mind for what we believe is right, and it doesn't match with what the other person believes is right. And we cannot force anybody to be on the same spectrum, which is what we're trying to do by everybody being tolerant with everybody and accepting everyone and doing free business with everyone. It cannot work. There is a certain level of respect and government structure that can make it so we can abide peaceably despite our differences. There's a Christian kindness that helps us to live despite our differences and to love each other. But to do so unconditionally as the world wants it to be, it is impossible.
Yeah, there's not really room. Yeah, there's not really room for everybody to use the same bathroom at the same time. Mm-hmm. We can't all sit on the same toilet. And that might sound like a very strange analogy, but the reality is you can only fit so many people in one room at the same time. And we all desperately need to have our own spaces. And it's the same thing with the government trying to regulate what you can and can't see on the internet. And the same thing with people trying to say whether you can or can't buy a wedding cake for your wedding, whether it's a same-sex marriage or not. Private business is private business, and it may be unfair that somebody says you can't buy my wedding cake because I don't support gay marriage. It may be unfair, but that doesn't mean that you have to close the business and force them to do that, to go against their own principles.
That kind of goes on to the definition of what fairness is. The way that fair is used nowadays is inclusivity, and that's not the definition of fair. Mm-hmm. Fair is equal opportunity, and in a capitalist society, equal opportunity means if I make a business, if I decide to be an author and I own my book, I have the right to say who I'm going to sell that to, who I'm not going to sell that to, who I'm going to sell with. I have that power because that is given to me by the Constitution. And it is thus fair because every other person has a right to create their own business and do exactly the same. Equal opportunity. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we're all going to be on the same level of success or have the same rules, but it is fair because it is equal. And that is a very different thing than being inclusive.
And I think a lot of people will have an easy time picking out those words that are emotionally charged from this conversation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why we started with what we did, was because a lot of what we're saying is not a personal attack on anyone. You have to understand that what we believe is that there's an understanding that regardless of what we think is fair or correct, the reality is, the people are going to make their choices, and the people as a collective are going to decide whether or not something is right or wrong or okay. But at the end of the day, if we try to force everyone to think the exact same way, then that's no different than the dystopian books that we read or the dystopian movies we watch where we go, oh, they're breaking from the norm, and now they've created a whole new world of not only chaos but choice. So many people think that there is one correct choice, and if everyone followed that correct choice perfectly, then everything would just be fine. The reality is that we do need variety, and we do need opposition. We do need those things that allow us to grow as individuals. When we have different religious practices and we, discuss those things with people, that only helps us grow as people. When we have different political views and we discuss them, not exclude people from them, but we discuss them and then agree to disagree. That's the most important part, is agree to disagree on things. If we can't do that, then our conversations and us living peaceably is out the window.
Exactly. You kind of bring up a point that C.S. Lewis actually starts in his preface, which is about the differing religions, which actually, part of my book, The Lattice Scheme, Detective Granger actually makes a comment when they go to visit a Catholic church, and he's a Christian, and so is Azure, and he says, it all administers to our education. It's all beautiful. Worship is beautiful, however they do it. C.S. Lewis's big point on writing this book was not to cater to any specific religion. It was not to push anybody in a specific direction. He was very serious in the preface about really putting people just on the very basic level of what is Christianity by definition, instead of you need to be an Anglican, you need to be a Catholic, you need to be a Baptist, or any of that. He makes a lot of good points. Like, he says one of the things Christians are disagreed about is the importance of their disagreements. When two Christians of different denominations start arguing, it is usually not long before one asks whether such and such point really matters, and the other replies, matters. It's absolutely essential. And so he's trying to write, not in the least to conceal or evade his responsibility to his own beliefs, but to allow us to form ours. And he kind of likens this book to being brought into a hallway. You enter a building. The building is Christianity. And there's several different doors. And you get to pick a door. You can pick any door. But whatever door you pick, once you are on the other side of that door, it is not your responsibility to dictate where other people in the hallway go. It is your responsibility to kindly treat those who are within your sphere of hallway, or whatever room that you've picked, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're in the hallway, to be kind to those who are likewise testing out different doors. That is Christianity in its definition. There is a value in allowing everybody choice. Basic Christianity is that there was a war fought in heaven over our ability to choose for ourselves. Satan was going to force us all to heaven. That wouldn't work because that would ruin God's justice, which is its own discussion. Mm-hmm. Or we could have a choice who we wanted to become and how we wanted to become it. God would provide a framework that we could follow, and there's nuances within that framework. God can tell you need to walk across the road, but as to how you walk across that road, the speed you walk, the style you walk, all that's up to you, and that is the essence of what we're doing in this podcast. Is we're not trying to signal out someone else and say your life choices are wrong, your politics are wrong, your beliefs are wrong. No, it's let's look at a different way of thinking and looking at the world.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between telling someone they're wrong and telling them that the way that they're thinking about their problems and issues are what's causing so much stress and anxiety in your life. And that's essentially it, right? I don't care what religion you are. I don't care what sexual orientation you are. I don't care what ethnicity you are. But I do care if you're spreading hate.
Mm-hmm.
I do care if you're trying to shove that down someone else's throat. Because I don't want to throw what I believe down someone else's throat, but I certainly would love to have a conversation about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the most important thing. If we understand that I'm just as human as the gay couple down the street, cool. Like we can actually have a conversation and maybe even have a good relationship, which is like
good friends.
That is the most important part about this whole thing. We want to spread like an understanding that there's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're all humans on a journey.
Mm-hmm.
We're literally all in the same boat. We like to pretend that we're not, but we are. It's how things are. And we're all passionate about things. There are things that we love. We have pains, we have fears. We all have this experience, and it's very difficult when we're constantly making it harder on ourselves by treating each other like we're not brothers and sisters, that we're not humans.
Mm-hmm.
We are literally the highest intelligible form of existence on this planet. That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's utterly incredible. C.S. Lewis has said it's an incredible thing to be in a society walking around people that could become gods and goddesses. That even the least person that you meet has the potential of being someone that you would be tempted to worship someday. Like, that is everybody's potential. No matter how far they seem to have fallen by society's labels or misdefinitions or your own personal ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is so much potential in every person, and learning to see people, truly see them for who they are, that is what brings peace and growth and happiness to society. And I've said it before in a podcast, but that's why we do everything we do. We all want to be happy, and we're never going to be happy unless we can all be happy together. And that doesn't happen when we force anybody in. Going back to our Christmas Carol podcast, that's what Scrooge was doing wrong. He wanted everybody to follow his path, his way, to achieve what he did, and he was miserable trying to force everyone to follow that standard. Sure. There needs to be a basic human standard. That is the law of nature. We all have a moral right or wrong. This is true. There needs to be a common language and standards followed. But the reason for those standards isn't to dictate what you believe or who you are. It is to empower you to choose who you are and to believe as you do. That's the difference of those controls, which are general controls to enable us, versus social controls.
Yeah. And I guess the crux of the whole idea behind this particular episode is that language is so powerful, and we're losing that power when we focus our energy into words and definitions of a purely emotional sense. When we purely emotionally charge something, or we allow someone else's emotionally charged thinking to come at us, we're no longer seeing each other as human beings or brothers and sisters. We're seeing them as enemies or friends.
Or even objects.
Yeah, enemies, friends, or objects, and we don't want that at all. Yes, we want people to be our friends, and we do want to be able to recognize who is our friend and who's, somebody that we maybe don't associate with on a heavy basis. But by all means, we need basic, everyday respect for the individual. And if we don't fix our language, if we don't reintroduce the truth behind what we're trying to say, then we really just confuse, frustrate, and break apart the most important thing, which is a commonality between all of our neighbors.
Exactly. Words are powerful, words have meaning, so let's use them meaningfully, is a good way to put it. So that is just our little take starting out on Mere Christianity. Yes, the focus is Christianity, so we will talk a lot of Christianity in this, but we're taking a literary deep dive for a deeper human perspective from it. We would be super excited to get any of your comments, anything that you think, not just from this book, but from our discussion in general, any other perspectives that you have. Also, let us know how proper language has influenced you, or any difficulties you've had with language over the years. Like, I've had plenty. I'm sure that you have. And there's always different perspectives out there from those who have immigrated or speak dual languages, as do I. So we would be super happy to hear that from you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for tuning in. And yeah, if there's any other books or especially nonfiction, we love discussing nonfiction work. Feel free to leave that in the comments as well, just so we can continue, hopefully, a lot of good discussion that opens each other's minds. And if you think we're closed-minded about something, feel free to comment that, and we can have a conversation about whatever.
Yeah, we'd love to learn from you. And kind of along those lines, definitely hit me up if you're an author, nonfiction or fiction, especially fiction. If you have a powerful meaning to your book or message from your story, we would love to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us. We will see you next time.
Bye-bye.